Hey folks, tonight we're diving into a topic less philosophical, but just as complicated. Viking sex? Yeah. It's about politics, power, and sometimes way too public. So before you get too comfy, take a sec to hit like and subscribe only if you actually dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Always fun to see who's tagging along from around the globe. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's sleepy journey together. Let's clear this up. Vikings were cleaner than you've been told. Not spa day clean, but by medieval standards. They basically smelled like soap angels. While most Europeans thought bathing was either sinful or a royal pain, Norwegians scrubbed weekly, using real soap made from animal fat and ash. Sure, it probably smelled like dirt, but next to their filthy neighbors, they were lavender clouds of smugness. They combed hair, trimmed beards, filed nails, and even carried grooming kits made of bone and iron. Imagine prepping for a hot date with an intricately carved comb, neat braids, and minty breath in a world where most people stuffed dry grass under their arms. English monks noticed this suspicious hygiene trend and recorded it with a side eye. There's a famous complaint from an Anglo-Saxon chronicler basically saying Viking men were just too clean and therefore not attractive to local women. Yep, you heard that right. Their official explanation for Viking success with the ladies was basically a soap opera lie. The monks weren't wrong. In a world smelling like a compost heap, a guy who bathed once a week and knew how to braid hair was basically a sex god. But this wasn't just vanity. In Viking society, hygiene mattered. If you were a free man, you had to look like one, which meant grooming. If you looked dirty, people assumed you were poor, a slave, or worse, a lazy slob who couldn't even comb lice eggs out of his woman's hair. Cleanliness also had ritual meaning. Before parties, battles, or bedroom adventures, you bathed, not just to get the dirt off, but to prepare yourself to face gods, ancestors, or your secret crush. If you think Viking romance was just grunts and dragging someone into a longhouse by their braids, think again. They weren't just bloodthirsty raiders. They were quirky, sensitive, and loved their metaphors, expressing love through poetry and sometimes gentle threats. Vikings had a whole tradition of roasting poetry, dense metaphorical poetry so intense Shakespeare looks like a grocery list. And, yep, they used it for flirting. A Viking guy might compare a woman's hair to sunlit flax, her walk to a swan on the sea, or if things heated up, her body to a finely forged sword. That's not just flirting, that's cultural seduction. If your poem didn't include at least 3 confusing nature details, you messed up. But it wasn't all flowers and fjords. These poems could get downright vivid. And if a man wrote about a woman without her okay, that was dangerous, sometimes even illegal. Iceland's medieval Gragas law actually banned men from writing obscene, slanderous, or dirty poems. If a guy implied a woman was ready to get it on when she wasn't, he risked exile or even death. Yeah, Viking society took dirty poetry that seriously. If there are at least 3 weird nature details, you've already messed up. But not every place is just flowers and narrow bays. These poems could be pretty lively. And if a guy wrote a poem about a woman without her permission, that was considered dangerous. Sometimes even illegal. There was an actual law in medieval Iceland's Gragas Code that banned men from writing obscene, slanderous, or pornographic poetry. If a guy implied a woman was up for it when she wasn't, he could be exiled or even executed. Yeah, In Viking society, writing a dirty poem about someone's daughter could get you legal trouble in a duel. By the way, women weren't just standing around blushing. They were totally capable of firing back with some seriously sharp verses. If a guy's poem was clumsy, crude, or lazy, she could publicly humiliate him with a savage comeback so brutal the whole family would avoid eye contact at parties for generations. In one story, a woman shut down a guy's advances with such poetic finesse that he had to slink away in shame and join a monastery. Yup, she flirted so hard he found God. So, while the Vikings slink off in shame and join a monastery. Yup, she flirted so hard he found God. So while Vikings packed swords and axes, the real weapons in matters of the heart were poetry full of metaphors, boasting. And you could actually get sued if you got too cocky. Let's not kid ourselves. Viking romance wasn't just about rose petals and candlelight. It was more like, my dad owns 3 goats. I've got a strong back. Let's make this legally binding. Consent was there. Sure. But it had to survive a crowd of conservatives, alliances, an extended family, all with their own opinions. Here's how it usually went down. A guy decided he wanted to get married. He didn't serenade his crush under the stars. Nope. He sent his dad, uncle, or most diplomatic buddy, to negotiate with her dad, because nothing screams passion like haggling over your potential future with me and sheep prices. And, technically, the woman had a say. Technically, a freeborn woman could say no to marriage. But whether that was accepted totally depended on if her family needed land, alliances, or just wanted to get rid of a stubborn daughter. Some legends say a strong-willed woman could reject a suitor. Others say she should just run like hell if she wanted. But Vikings weren't totally barbarians about this. A forced marriage. She could call in the law. She could stand before witnesses and declare herself divorced. No paperwork, no courts, just 3 public announcements. Basically, the medieval Norse version of shouting, "It's not me, it's you," at a dinner party. Now, bride kidnapping might sound romantic in some mistranslated stories, but Viking law wasn't having it, frowning, but not necessarily stopping it. Kidnapping women to marry was illegal, but sometimes celebrated in poetry. Nothing screams mixed messages like a law code and a love song giving you totally opposite advice. Then there were the mistresses, or, as Viking law charmingly called them, bed companions. These were women, often slaves, expected to cook, clean, and of course, provide the bedroom services. Consent here was mostly decorative. The upside, if the husband was emotionally or physically incompetent, the wife could just walk away. Viking women didn't have to suffer in silence. They could suffer publicly and get legal protection too. When it came to premarital relationships, Vikings were surprisingly chill. Unlike their medieval neighbors, obsessed with chastity belts and preaching purity. The Norse were way more laid back. In fact, a woman's past didn't necessarily matter unless it involved someone else's husband, or a messy public scandal with the neighbors. Premarital affairs, not taboo, just life. Vikings were practical. If 2 consenting adults had a relationship, the world didn't end. Families might raise an eyebrow or both if the timing seemed suspicious. But they weren't locking their daughters in towers or inventing chastity devices. Virginity was never the ultimate value for a woman. Women were respected for skills, family status, and yes, their reputation. But that rep wasn't totally tied to what they had or hadn't done in the bedroom. In fact, some fairy tales even celebrated brave women going after what they wanted, especially if they did it confidently and wielded a strong sword arm. This wasn't just cultural flexibility, it was survival logic. Viking society needed tight cooperation. A woman who could run a farm, manage a business, and handle legal disputes solo was way more valuable than one with a squeaky clean love life. Life was tough. Winters were longer. Practicality usually won out. Still, caution was encouraged. Though premarital hookups weren't illegal, but bragging about them, that could land you in hot water. If a guy openly bragged about an ex and she didn't approve of the story, he might find himself facing legal trouble. Basically, kissing and talking about it were seen as rude and sometimes outright illegal. So, Vikings respected personal freedom, as long as you didn't stir up unnecessary drama at the party. If you think modern myths are strange, wait until you meet the Norse pantheon, a divine soap opera where shape-shifting, disguises, and dramatic love affairs only happen on Tuesdays. Let's start with Frey, the god of fertility. Subtlety was definitely not his strong suit. He's often described as being way too enthusiastic about his role. His sacred statue supposedly had very reliable anatomical features. His worship involved rituals celebrating life, love, and some very suggestive crops. If you want a modest god, Frey is not your guy. Then there's Loki, the beloved chaos agent. In one tale, Loki turns into a mare. Yep, a mare used to distract a magical stallion, and it worked so well that Loki got pregnant and later gave birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Somehow, this is seen as quirky folklore rather than a cosmic HR nightmare. In another story, Thor dresses as a woman to crash a wedding and retrieve his stolen hammer. His outfit, a wedding dress and a veil. His plan was to grumble a lot and hope no one noticed. The beard hidden under the veil. Spoiler alert, they noticed. But the hammer was recovered, and everyone went home a bit confused. Why? Does any of this matter? Because Vikings didn't treat romance, gender, or intimacy like minor details. Their myths were messy, inconsistent, and completely inappropriate by modern Sunday school standards. In fact, many Norse gods and heroes were involved in relationships modern cultures would need entire legal seminars to unpack. The line between affection and absurdity was thin, and the gods often crossed it, usually on horseback. But here's the kicker. These myths weren't shocking. They were normal. Fertility, love, deceit, all divine powers in their book. The gods misbehaved not because they were evil, but because life is complicated. And sometimes, your biggest lesson comes from a shape-shifting mare mom. Viking society had plenty of rules, lots of them, but when it came to sex and relationships, those rules were negotiable, flexible, or frankly, you could do whatever you wanted as long as you didn't get caught being unmanly while doing it. Let me explain. For Viking men, the worst insult wasn't thief, liar, or even coward. It was being called passive, a word so heavy it sparked fierce arguments. Being called ergi meant you were submissive, obedient, or failed to fulfill your manly duties, especially in love. The issue wasn't orientation, it was dominance. Viking masculinity wasn't about who you were with, but how you acted. If you were seen as compliant, you weren't just teased, your entire reputation could sink faster than a poorly built longship. On the flip side, women had a bit more wiggle room. While society was male-dominated, don't worry, it really was. Women had social and legal rights that made many medieval European ladies green with envy. They could own land, demand divorce, and even state their preferences. Still, expectations were practical. A woman who was too blunt or assertive might be seen as masculine. But, in a weird Viking way, that wasn't always an insult. Some female heroes in the stories were praised for sharp wit and sword skills, but those same traits in a man, if misunderstood, could get him publicly mocked or accused of witchcraft. Yep, still pretty practical. A woman who's too blunt or bossy might get labeled masculine, but in a weird Viking twist, that wasn't always an insult. Some heroines were praised for their sharp tongues and sword skills, but those same traits on a man could get him publicly mocked or accused of witchcraft if misunderstood. Yep, witchcraft, magic, especially cedar, a Nordic ritual tied to emotions and prophecy, was considered unmanly. That was women's work. If a man did it, folks assumed he was probably spinning some weird tale, crying, and suspiciously, maybe even writing poetry. Ironically, Odin, the Norse god's big boss, was a master of sitar. But apparently, when in Viking society, clubs and stones could break bones, but words could get you stabbed legally. Insults weren't playground jokes. If someone questioned your honor, manliness, or sexual prowess, you could challenge them. Yep, just say one wrong thing, and suddenly you're shirtless in the woods at dawn, sword in hand, all because you hinted that your neighbor Olaf isn't exactly enthusiastic under his fur coat. At the core of this was something called Enid, a special kind of public insult. Calling someone Argry or Rager basically meant they weren't manly in a way nobody wanted to hear. That's a fight starter, not just words. We're talking legally approved battles, sometimes to the death, now. Before you think Vikings were just insecure dudes, remember, reputation was everything. These were tiny, tight-knit communities. If someone called you weak, cowardly, or worse, passive in love matters, that wasn't just personal. It was social suicide. And it cut both ways. If you threw accusations without proof in court, you risked exile. So people chose their insults carefully. And when they didn't, someone ended up dead by a fjord. Funny thing, these disputes often had nothing to do with actual private life. Usually, it was about perception, rumors, careless words, bad timing jokes, all capable of chaos if they questioned someone's identity or status. In short, Viking society was not chill about trash talk, but all this reveals something deeper. Public image and close bonds were connected. A man's power was his romantic rep. If you got mocked for being passive, weak, or out of control, you didn't just lose face, you lost credibility. And once that's gone, good luck keeping your spot at the party. In Viking culture, love and marriage were fine until someone got caught messing with a neighbor's spouse. Then things got loud, legal, and sometimes bloody. Let's start with the basics. Adultery was condemned, but not equally. If a married woman was caught cheating, serious trouble. Her husband could divorce her, shame her publicly, or depending on his honor, grab his sword and confront the other man. In serious cases, the lover might not make it out alive. Now, if a man cheated on his wife, well, that depended. Sleeping with an unmarried woman usually wasn't a big deal. But if she was married, that was crossing the line, especially if her husband was hot-tempered or had a bunch of brothers. Now, here's where it gets juicy. If a wife caught her husband cheating, she could take legal action and get a divorce. Viking women had real options. Legends tell of calm wives packing up, announcing the marriage was over in front of witnesses, and walking away, sometimes taking the farm, kids, and even the goats with them. Back then, Norse law didn't just rely on whispered accusations. If you claimed someone cheated, you had to prove it. Usually, that meant catching them in the act or gathering witnesses. Just made a fool of himself. You lost your street cred, and once that's gone, good luck scoring an invite to the party. In Viking society, love and marriage were all good and fine until someone got caught fooling around with the neighbor's spouse. Then things got noisy, legal, and sometimes bloody. Let's start with the basics. Cheating was condemned, but not for everyone. If a married woman was caught stepping out, that was serious business. Her husband could divorce her, shame her publicly, or, depending on how offended he was, grab his sword and confront the other guy directly. In the worst cases, the lover might not survive the encounter much better than when he arrived. Now, if a man cheated on his wife, well, that depended. Sleeping with an unmarried woman was usually no big deal. But if that woman was married to someone else, that crossed a line, especially if her husband was hot-tempered or had a bunch of brothers. And here's where things get juicy. If a wife caught her husband cheating, she could legally divorce him. Viking women had some real options. In fact, legends tell of wives calmly packing their bags, declaring the marriage over in front of witnesses, then walking away, sometimes taking the farm, kids, and even the goats with them. Back then, Norse law didn't rely on hushed accusations. If you claimed someone cheated, you had to prove it. Usually by catching them in the act or finding witnesses, which, as you can imagine, made family dinners super awkward. Physical revenge wasn't always legal, but Viking culture didn't exactly need permits to get payback. If someone tarnished your family's honor, don't be surprised if you found a smashed door, a burned barn, or a suspicious hunting accident waiting for them. But despite the risks, people still cheated. Humans gonna human. Basically, Viking adultery laws were less about morals and more about honor and property. Who got insulted, who got stabbed, and who ended up with the livestock. But despite the risks, people still cheated. Humans are humans. After all, basically, Viking adultery laws cared less about morality and more about honor and property. Who got humiliated, stabbed, and who ended up with the livestock? That's the real deal. So cheating wasn't exactly a crime worthy of moral outrage. Instead, it came with lawsuits, jewelry battles, and sometimes full-on goat custody wars. Viking romance wasn't always about charm, poetry, or a strong jawline. Sometimes it was about magic, specifically a mysterious method called Sita, pronounced sour, part magic, part spiritual therapy, and part revenge for an ex who refused to return my rune. The Sita ritual was used for all sorts of things: fortune-telling, cursing enemies, messing with the weather, and sometimes manipulating love and desire if feelings weren't mutual. A well-timed spell could suddenly make someone think you're the hottest thing in Valhalla. Coincidence? No way. But here's the kicker. Cedar was considered a woman's art. Women performed this ritual openly, often as respected seers or witches. Men, not so much. A guy dabbling in cedar risked being labeled unmanly, not because of the magic, but because he was doing women's work, which Viking masculinity just couldn't handle. There's even a story about Odin, king of the gods, getting flack for using cedar. His enemies just said, "Oh, magic. How mysterious. But dude, you're kinda embarrassing us." To be fair, Odin didn't care. When you've got one eye and raise a raven, public opinion isn't what it used to be. As for love magic itself, it ranged from harmless charms to actual love potions. Just imagine sip this herbal tea and fall madly in love, or else your cows might get unlucky. Vikings never did anything halfway. Of course, there were risks. If you got caught using magic to win someone's heart, especially without consent, it could backfire legally and supernaturally. People believed bad magic was like an ugly boomerang, and you definitely don't want your love spell turning into a chaotic emotional explosion for the whole village. Still, for the brave with a bag of herbs, cedar was the go-to. Not everyone could write love poems, but anyone could try a love spell and hope it worked. Modern romance relies on ambiance, dim lighting, candles, and a Spotify playlist. Vikings had firelight, snoring livestock, and 6 relatives pretending not to notice a thing. Speaking of privacy, or rather, the total lack of it, Viking homes were longhouses, open spaces where whole families lived, worked, ate, and even slept together. Not in a weird way, just in a try not to freeze way. The whole clan parents, elders, kids, workers, and sometimes a couple of goats shared one big space. Walls, curtains, fancy decorations, personal space. Nope, not in Scandinavia back then. So when it came to intimacy, you couldn't sneak into a cozy private room. You probably just rolled over by the fire, pulled up your fur blanket, and tried to ignore Uncle Bjorn snoring 2 feet away. Romantic? Not really. Effective? Absolutely. This lack of privacy didn't stop anyone. Viking culture wasn't too fussed about community living realities. People just accepted that intimacy happened. Sometimes you heard it. Sometimes you smelled it while someone stirred the stew. Kids were often conceived in these crowded longhouses, and everyone developed a collective skill called strategic pretending. You didn't acknowledge it. You didn't comment. You definitely didn't make eye contact. You just stared into the fire and thought about fish. Now, if you really wanted privacy, you had options. Wealthier families could hang tapestries or set up partitions. The Viking equivalent of a do not disturb sign, but for regular Norse couples. A little discretion and good timing was the best you could hope for. But for average folks, a bit of subtlety and the right moment was your best bet. Still, despite no privacy, there was nothing really shameful about it. Viking society wasn't nearly as hung up on modesty as other cultures. Christianity later in Europe. Getting physically close was natural, necessary, and everyone knew it. They just didn't want to talk about it when the lady was around. Let's talk birth control, or, as the Vikings might call it, hope, herbs, and maybe a little magic. There's no Viking medical manual titled How to Avoid Babies While Busy Pillaging. But clues exist, and from those clues, we can say they had some ideas on managing reproduction, or at least slowing it down when needed. First off, Viking women knew their herbs, not just for healing wounds or curing fevers, but to avoid sudden family size explosions. Plants like yarrow, mugwort, and wild carrot were famous all over Europe for birth control. Did they work? Maybe. Did they taste like regret and sadness? Probably. There's also evidence some used extended breastfeeding strategically to delay the next pregnancy. Not romantic, but effective. Think of it as the Viking version of spacing kids, no spreadsheets required. But here's the kicker. Viking culture wasn't obsessed with reproduction like later religious societies. Kids were valued. Sure, especially boys who could fight and girls who could snag a good husband. But sex wasn't just about making heirs. Pleasure was a legit part of the equation. Even their folk tales paint surprisingly real romantic encounters. Couples fell in love, drifted apart, got bored, and divorced, just casually accepting human nature like it's no big deal. That shows a culture focused less on purity or guilt and more on practicality. Of course, if birth control failed, the woman usually got the blame. Men weren't expected to know much about this stuff. A guy could navigate stormy seas using just the stars and a crow. But ask him how mugwort works, and he'd stare at you like you sprouted a second axe, wondering if Vikings had same-sex relationships. Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. But only if you're good with optics. Vikings didn't use our modern terms for sex, but they definitely understood that sometimes people form close, even romantic bonds with the same sex. Sounds pretty open for a tough culture. Right. But there's a catch. Respect. See, Viking masculinity was built on dominance, not just in battle, but in every part of life. If two men were involved, social consequences weren't about who loved whom, but who did what. Specifically, the guy seen as passive could get mocked, shamed, or worse, his manhood challenged. The issue wasn't morality, it was status. A man could wear fur, braid his beard, and serenade his best bud with emotional poems, still be admired. But if anyone suggested he wasn't the boss in private life, his rep could sink faster than a leaky longship. There are even tales of men accused like that demanding duels to defend their honor, because apparently, nothing screams, "I'm definitely top dog," like fighting someone at dawn over rumors of cuddling. What about women, honestly? They get less attention in legal texts, probably because their relationships weren't seen as threats to social order. Two women marrying didn't produce heirs, didn't mess with property rights, and didn't challenge the all-important male ego. So, while direct evidence is thin, it's totally possible such relationships existed and had power in their personal lives. It could wreck their reputation faster than a leaky longship. There are even stories of men accused like that demanding duels to defend their honor, because obviously, nothing proves you're the top dog like punching someone at dawn over rumors of hand-holding. What about women? Honestly, they get less attention in legal texts, probably because their relationships weren't seen as threats to social order. Two married women didn't produce heirs, didn't mess with property rights, and didn't challenge men's fragile egos. So, while we don't have tons of direct evidence, it's totally possible such relationships existed and were quietly accepted. or at least politely ignored. Interestingly, Norse gods didn't care about gender. Loki, as we mentioned, had both sons and daughters, and no one lost an eye over it. The divine realm was fluid. Only humans needed everything to fit into a neat little plot. If you think Viking marriages were just endless parties, sword swapping, and blood oaths, you might be surprised how peacefully they could actually end. Blood oaths aside, you'd be shocked how calmly they could call it quits. Because in Viking society, divorce wasn't some drawn-out court drama. It was more like, all right, done. I'm taking the cow. Good luck. Seriously, Viking women could pull this off with just a clear voice and a couple of witnesses. Here's how it worked. A woman could end the marriage by standing in front of a group of people, ideally at the front door or the couple's bed. Yep, for real. Then she'd just announce she was leaving. Bonus points if she gave a reason: abandonment, abuse, or the classic, he won't stop reading bad poetry in bed. And that was it. Once declared, the marriage was considered over. Property and kids were split up, usually based on social customs or prior agreements. Kids and stuff were divvied up according to tradition or deals already in place. It wasn't always tidy, but boy was it efficient. No 6-month waiting period. No custody battles dragging through 3 winters. Plus, Viking women usually walked away with their dowry intact, and sometimes even kept control over land or valuables they brought into the marriage. Divorce didn't turn women into social pariahs. Actually, many remarried, especially if they were rich, skilled, or the type who could wrestle a goat without breaking a sweat. Of course, not every breakup was peaceful. Some came with accusations, grudges, and occasionally dramatic exits. But even then, the culture generally accepted that sometimes. People just gotta move on. The gods are chaotic. So why shouldn't relationships be? Worth noting, men could divorce too, in a similar way, though their reasons usually involve disobedience, which probably tells you all you need to know about male expectations. If you think modern weddings are weird, wait till you hear about Viking goat sacrifices, bride swords, and their downright bizarre bedroom rituals. Viking weddings weren't just parties. They were political mergers, legal contracts, and community events smelling stronger than smoked fish. The festivities could last up to a week, depending on how rich or dramatic the family was. Think Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more passive-aggressive toasts. The bride and groom had some serious symbolic prep. The bride would let her hair down. That's code for I'm done with being a girl. And sometimes wear a sleek almond necklace if the family wanted her to look legendary. Meanwhile, the groom might brandish his ancestral sword, because nothing screams I'm ready to commit like waving a weapon in your in-laws' faces. But here's where it gets truly Viking: the consumption. Not just encouraged, mandatory. And in some places, this had to be witnessed. Yep, witnessed. In some cases, a few unlucky relatives stood by the door, holding torches to make sure the couple sealed the deal and didn't pass out from nerves or too much mead. Why? Because this wasn't about love. It was about contract confirmation. Marriage affected inheritance, land rights, and alliances. So if you didn't seal the deal, someone down the line might challenge the whole thing's legality. Way easier to just awkwardly nod from behind the curtain and hope for minimal eye contact. Of course, not every wedding was this grand. In less theatrical communities, this act was just assumed, or worse, confirmed by loud boasting at breakfast the next day. Land rights and alliances. So, if you didn't follow through, Someone might later challenge the whole alliance's legitimacy. Way easier to just give an awkward nod from behind the curtain and pray for minimal eye contact. Of course, not every wedding was a big, flashy deal. In less theatrical communities, this whole thing was either just assumed or worse, loudly bragged about over breakfast the next morning. Plus, there were rituals with hammers, shouting Hail Thor, drinking together, and solemn swearing-in ceremonies, witnesses, and, before me, liters of booze. Actually, the original honeymoon meant drinking honey mead during the full moon after the wedding to boost fertility. Romantic and a little sticky. Now, maybe you realize that Viking intimacy wasn't just about raiding and grumbling. This whole play had layers: strategic, poetic, a bit magical, and definitely more than just pillaging and grumbling, sometimes performed alongside a goat. Viking culture didn't treat sex like a dirty secret to hide. It was just part of life, like farming, raiding, or wondering if your neighbor's plotting revenge. It served sacred and practical purposes, making heirs, forging alliances, settling beefs, and sometimes just surviving a brutally long winter. Passion was real, but tangled up with reputation, law, honor, and community expectations. You didn't just fall in love, you made sure your aunt, livestock, and 3 sword-wielding uncles gave the thumbs up. Romance wasn't private. This was a group project. The epic tales themselves are packed with love, jealousy, clever women, and emotionally numb dudes. Some stories end with dramatic weddings, others with someone vanishing into the fog while another stabs a cousin for being smug. Either way, it's a beautiful, intense, emotional soap opera. And throughout it, Viking women were anything but passive side characters. They seduced, divorced, cursed, negotiated, and sometimes burned, stuffed down. They were respected for their smarts, feared for their curses, and sometimes immortalized in poetry which, in Viking speak, is the highest compliment. Even their gods treated love as a battlefield. Loki switched genders. Frey flaunted his fertility like a prize pumpkin. And Odin dived headfirst into romantic magic without blinking. The divine set the tone. Love was fierce, unpredictable, and definitely not parent-approved. So, what was Viking sex actually like? It was communal, pretty poetic, right legally. It was complicated. It could win you honor or get you exiled. It made public appearances at awkward times and, oddly enough, progressed at the right ones. And probably most important to Vikings, it wasn't about being perfect. It was about surviving love with your pride, farm, and sword arm intact. Because when the Norse loved, they did it like everything else with fire, light, and zero apologies. If you were a medieval peasant, don't think holidays meant sipping wine by the fire while someone else did your chores. No. Holidays were sacred days. Religious rituals were held all through the calendar. Theoretically, you'd get a break after hard work. In reality, you might still be roped into fixing the church roof, cooking stew for the whole village, or chasing runaway pigs during the festival, still better than weeding turnips. Luckily, the church gave peasants dozens of holidays. We're talking Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, the Virgin Mary festivals, and random local holy days honoring relics like St. Gertrude's toenail clippings. These weren't optional. They were sacred times when you had to stop work, attend Mass, and ideally reflect on your sinful soul. But practical peasants figured out how to turn these holy days into moments of joy, partying, and sometimes downright wild drinking. Take Yule, for example, not just one day, but 12 days of storytelling by the fire, singing carols, and if you were lucky, someone showing up with a roast pig. It was like a medieval Netflix binge combined with a holiday feast. But don't get too comfy. Your lord might skip rent that day, but expect your son to serve drinks at his table, or your daughter to help the lady of the manor enjoy her day off. Holidays blurred the lines between sacred rest. Your lord might not expect rent on holiday, but he might expect your son to serve drinks at his table, or your daughter to help the lady of the manor relax on her day off. Holidays blurred the line between sacred rest and unpaid community service. But, hey, there was a strong sense of community. This wasn't some lonely spa day. These were communal rituals. Everyone in your village wore their nicest, least dirty clothes, shared scarce food supplies, and pretended for a day that life wasn't just work. Taxes and toothaches. Yep. Peasants had holidays. Lots of them. Actually. But every holiday came with strings attached. Go to church. Don't work the fields. Maybe help with the mystery play. And for heaven's sake, don't get caught sneaking off for a nap in the tent unless you want Father Bartholomew to give you the sternest scolding and a week of penance. Ah, Yule. The most magical time of the year. Assuming your idea of magic includes dead animals on spits, evergreen branches nailed to beams, and your uncle passed out in a pile of hay. For medieval peasants, Yule wasn't just a holiday. It was 12 long, wild, sometimes downright chaotic days between Christmas and Epiphany when the usual rules got loosened, and even the poorest souls got a taste of festive cheer. It kicked off on Christmas Eve when the Yule log, a real tree, not some chocolate bar, was hauled into the hearth and kept burning nonstop all through the season. Its ashes were considered lucky, which makes sense, because keeping a huge log burning for 12 days in a medieval house is basically a controlled house fire. Partying was the main event of Yule, though what counted as partying could vary wildly. If your village had a generous lord, you might be blessed with plenty of meat, beer, and a communal pig roasted on a spit. Otherwise, dry beans, mystery stew, and bread with real salt were considered luxuries. You took what you could get, then sang about it loudly, off-key, and usually drunk. There were also songs, games, and masks, because nothing says Christ's birthday like dressing up as a bear and scaring your neighbors. These traditions carried ancient pre-Christian customs, pagan solstice rituals repackaged with a Christian twist. For example, evergreens symbolized eternal life, and hanging them indoors wasn't just decoration. The point was to ward off evil spirits, or, by peasant logic, rats. It was also one of the rare times social norms flipped upside down. Some villages appointed a lord of misrule, usually the village idiot, who got temporary power to mock the nobility and stage shenanigans. For 12 days, the lowest ranked could act like the top dog, until the calendar got flipped and reality collapsed like a thatched roof in January. Still, despite all the noise and nonsense, Yule was sacred, not just in the religious sense, but emotionally. It was warmth in the cold, light in the dark, laughter in a world where teeth were optional by age 30. During those 12 days, peasants weren't just survivors, they were celebrators. And on January 6th, back to work. The pork bones were gone, the beer sour, and your wife was glaring at you to fix the barn roof you ignored for a week. If Yule was about beer and ashes, then May Day was about flowers and fertility, not just the kind in the fields. For medieval peasants, May 1st wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was a riot of color, music, and mischief, celebrated with reckless joy, only possible when winter was finally over and the crops were still hanging in there. The festival kicked off at dawn as villagers raced into the woods to welcome May. Branches, blooming flowers, and sometimes a little scandal. Young folks especially loved this tradition, often disappearing in pairs and coming back looking way scruffier than when they left. The elders might frown, but no one complained. After all, babies born in early February were just a tiny part of village life's rhythm. The centerpiece of the festival was the maypole, a tall wooden pole raised in the village green, decked out with ribbons, flowers, and all sorts of local symbols that would make Freud blush. Peasants danced in circles around it, laughing, sweating, and pretending it wasn't an ancient pagan fertility idol in plain sight. All sorts of local symbols that would make a Freud fan blush. Peasants danced around it in circles, laughing, sweating, pretending it wasn't an overtly pagan fertility idol from the good old days. Of course, the church wasn't thrilled, but who cared? The dancing went on. Even Father Bartholomew sometimes tapped his foot to the beat. Music filled the air drums, flutes, even bagpipes if you were unlucky. There was theater, racing, and wrestling too. Some villages even had fire jumping to prove bravery or wish for a good year, while most of this was deeply symbolic, celebrating nature's rebirth and hoping for a bumper crop. But let's be honest, it was mostly an excuse to party. Farmers, who usually wore ragged clothes all year, suddenly pulled out their best outfits, which were still kinda torn, decked themselves out with flower crowns, and crowned a May Queen. She represented spring, youth, and beauty, which, in rural speak, basically meant having solid teeth and no nasty sores popping out. Unlike religious holidays, International Workers' Day wasn't chained to church bells or Bible readings. It was a party for both body and soul, and even though the local lord might still come by to collect labor taxes the next morning, even the lowest peasants danced like they owned the pasture. The calendar was packed with saints. Each saint had their own special day. You'd think that meant endless parties? Technically, yes. But imagine having to throw a birthday bash for your Aunt Mildred every other day. And she happened to be a drug-addicted martyr nun. Welcome to the holy chaos of saint days. Peasants loved saint days not really for theological reasons, but because it was a legit excuse to stop plowing and start eating. These days usually kicked off with a village ceremony, followed by hours or even days of fun. Think processions with relics, muddy mystery games, kegs cracked open before noon, and some barefoot guy yelling about how Sam Blaze miraculously removed a fishbone. Every village had its favorite patron saint. Every village had a beloved patron saint. Some picked practical ones, Saint Isidore for farmers, Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Others spun local legends, like the nameless Saint Ethelbert, said to cure leprosy and hiccups. No matter the saint, the day involved honoring their memory with rituals, prayers, and sometimes spinning a goat If your town was lucky enough to have a relic, a finger bone, a scrap of cloth, or a suspiciously labeled eyeball claimed to be St. Agnes's actual eyeball, then the day turned into a full-blown feast. Pilgrims showed up. Merchants set up stalls. They put on plays about the saint's life, mixing heartfelt inspiration with slapstick, broken props, and at least one guy who forgot his lines. The best part, no work well, at least not in the fields. You might get roped into decorating, blowing a terrible trumpet during the parade, or fetching water for the communal stew. But that's hardly hard labor. You might even snag a piece of meat and hear some juicy gossip. Of course, the church kept a close eye on these festivals. Too much booze, too much dancing, and suddenly a religious celebration could turn into a wild farmer's party. Religious festivals risked turning into boisterous peasant feasts. Still, most clergy figured that fun, even messy, muddy, slightly sacrilegious fun, was better than despair. And if singing songs about St. Bridge while drinking beer kept spirits high, so be it. Just before Lent, the 40-day period of fasting, prayer, and pretending you're not sneaking cheese behind the church, came the masquerade festival. And for medieval peasants, this was the one time chaos wasn't just allowed, it was blessed. The carnival, or Shrovetide, was basically the medieval version of spring break, but with more turnips and fewer regrets. This happened right before Ash Wednesday and acted like a spiritual pressure valve. If you plan to live like a monk for weeks, you better party like a heretic first. Masks appeared, often weird or animal-shaped, letting peasants turn into something totally different. Demons, kings, talking pigs. Folks dressed as women sang bawdy songs about the nobility and held fake parades where the village idiots got crowned kings of fools. For once, about nobles and fake parades where village idiots got crowned kings of fools, for the first time, the line between lord and laborer got hilariously and dangerously blurry. The food absolutely bonkers. You had to eat all the fats, meats, and dairy banned during Lent. That means pancakes, sausages, butter-soaked everything, assuming you could afford such luxuries. It was a last hurrah for your taste buds before Lent kicked in, reminding everyone they were just dust and ashes. Plus, there were games. Farmers threw flour sacks at each other, stage fake battles in the fields, and occasionally try riding farm animals like their noble steeds. One super popular event was the farmers' lance joust, where two drunken villagers charged at each other with cabbages tied to sticks. The winner got nothing but a bruise and bragging rights. And while the church frowned on the wild antics, debauchery, mischief, and chicken theft, they also knew better than to cancel it all. The masquerade wasn't just fun and games. It was purification. A time when farmers could flip the world upside down, mock the powers that be, and even feel like masters of their own fate. Then came the ashes. When Lent arrived, masks burned, songs stopped, and the world got real quiet. Meat disappeared from the table. Bells tolled solemnly, and the villagers, who'd been half naked, dancing around fires 2 days earlier, now knelt in church, serious and hungry. But the memory of the festival lingered, like a reminder that joy, like wine, is best enjoyed fresh. So what do you get when you mix religion, theater, and a bunch of low-key dramatic farmers? Mystery plays the medieval blockbuster hits, long before Netflix, TikTok, or even Shakespeare. Farmers gathered to watch. Sweaty neighbors reenact Bible stories in full costume, sometimes on wagons. Mystery plays aren't mystery in the modern sense. They're not detective stories or horror flicks. The term comes from ministerium, Latin for craft or guild, since local guilds usually made them. So the bakers might stage the Last Supper while the butchers handled the crucifixion. Because, obviously, nothing says sacred suffering like real pig's blood, performed on big feast days and religious festivals. These plays turned public squares into makeshift theaters. Villagers dragged muddy boots to watch scenes from Genesis, Exodus, or Revelation, acted out by neighbors in straw-tied robes and surprisingly good spirits. Some plays toured the whole town on wagons, each wagon staging a different scene like a holy parade of biblical drama. Let's just say, the performances weren't always theologically accurate. Noah's wife might be portrayed as a nag who refuses to board until she finishes her beer. Devils in tight red pants chase sinners through the crowd to roaring laughter. And when Herod delivered a fiery monologue, it often ended with someone chucking veggies at his head. The line between piety and peasant comedy was razor thin. But these plays were more than just entertainment. They were education. Most farmers couldn't read, and Latin sermons might as well be bird songs. Mystery plays made Bible stories vivid, emotional, visual, and memorable. A man crowned with thorns, screaming in pain, sticks with you way more than a dusty scroll. Plus, the plays brought people closer together. They needed costumes, props, rehearsals, and teamwork. The whole village pitched in to pull this off, even when the angel forgot. Lines or St. Peter's beard caught fire from a stage torch. It was a glorious mess, but it was theirs. In medieval peasant life, weddings weren't just personal. They were the village's biggest excuse to throw a legit party. Technically, a sacrament. Spiritually, a public contract. Practically, a festival where beer flowed freely, and half the guests walked home wearing someone else's cloak. For farmers, marriage was both social and romantic. Families arranged unions to grab land, labor, or livestock. The bride's dowry, both social and romantic vibes. Families arranged unions to snag land, labor, or livestock. The bride's dowry might include a pig, a sack of barley, or a pretty decent-looking goat. Love was optional. Raising strong boys who could haul a plow was mandatory. The festival kicked off with a church ceremony, simple, short, usually held outdoors, right outside the church door. You needed witnesses. You needed blessings. But don't dream of a choir or an organ. If you're lucky, you might catch a one-string fiddle or some old Joffrey guy whistling through his missing teeth. After the vows, those missing teeth included. It's time to kick off the real party, and everyone's invited neighbors, family, even old Mr. Thatcher, who's always fashionably late. Because hospitality is sacred. Guests bring whatever they can bread, eggs, maybe a roast chicken if they're feeling generous. The bride's family usually handles most of it. And by generous, I mean sometimes boiling a chicken. Then comes the dancing, which can last for hours, maybe even all day. Medieval peasant dances aren't exactly gentle. They stomp, spin, throw stones until everyone's dizzy, and someone usually ends up in the fire. Local musicians play every instrument that hasn't been stomped to death yet. Plus, there are games, jokes about in-laws, silly songs, and contests ranging from who can drink fastest to guessing how many kids they'll have before the first harvest. All this amid cheers from folks who haven't had this much fun since last year's Labor Day. Eventually, the newlyweds get escorted to bed by the whole village. This kickoff ceremony comes with blessings, laughter, and some awkward prayers that make things weird. Then the party ends, and 9 months later, guess what? Another festival kicks off. Even with all the holidays, festivals, and official days off in the medieval calendar, peasants quickly learned a harsh truth. Holidays weren't always rest days. Usually, it just meant different work, more singing, and slightly better food. Sure, the fields could take a break, and so could the cows. But the roof still leaked. The priest's barn needed cleaning, and someone had to cook a giant onion stew for the community. Hoping against hope, it tasted good. Holidays weren't for lazing around. They were serving the community by lighting extra candles. Let's say it's St. Swithin's Day. No farm work. Great. Right. But now you're stuck helping build flower arches out of dead branches. Then you get shoved into a mystery play as a Roman soldier named Napatu, whose only job is to shout curses and fall dramatically into the mud at cue. Next, you stir the pot in the churchyard, while Father Bartholomew micromanages the spices in the churchyard, while Father Bartholomew overly controls your seasoning. Even the 12 days of Christmas weren't full-on downtime. Somebody had to fetch firewood, brew beer, roast the suspicious wild boar, and keep the firewood burning, basically pulling night shifts if the day ended early. Bad omens. Maybe the Black Death? No pressure. Kids and old folks didn't get off easy either. Kids were sent out to gather herbs or deliver oddly shaped bread to neighbors. The elderly usually sat by the fire telling stories hopefully not about fires, plagues, or runaway goats. Though to be fair, those were the best stories. Some villages had traditions like church cleaning day, cleverly scheduled on a saint's day, so it didn't feel like boring chores anymore. And if the local lord decided to sew a new flag or clean the moat before the feast, guess who volunteered? Of course. There were bright spots. Working on a holiday often came with extra food, maybe a sip of beer, and the shared grumbling of neighbors. Plus, nothing builds community like hauling a rotting log out of the village pond together. For medieval peasants, life was tough, but not totally dull. In fact, their calendar was packed with festivals, holy days, saints' days, and village weddings to make even modern event planners jealous. These events weren't just breaks. They gave structure, meaning, and rhythm to a life mostly filled with mud, hard labor, and taxes. Each season brought its own mix of sacred and social celebrations. Winter brought the warmth of Yule, candlelight, and fireside stories. Spring brought May Day, bursting with pulling a rotting log out of the village pond together. For medieval peasants, life was harsh, but not boring. In fact, the calendar was packed with festivals, holidays, saints' days, and village weddings that would give even modern event planners a headache. These events weren't just breaks. They gave structure, meaning, and rhythm to a life that was mostly mud, hard labor, and taxes. Every season brought its own mix of sacred and social celebrations. Winter brought the warmth of Yule, candlelight, and fireside storytelling. Spring brought May Day, bursting with flowers, campfires, and rosy cheeks disappearing beyond the fence. Summer is prime time for saint parades, pilgrimage fairs, and maybe, just maybe, a Lord's Manor party that doesn't taste like radish surprise. Autumn wraps up with the Harvest Festival. Not as flashy as a carnival or a huge bash, but deeply satisfying. After months sweating in the fields, farmers gather for a communal meal, thanking the saints for sparing them from famine or locusts. This time, there's dancing, beer, and grilled stuff that probably shouldn't be grilled. But no one complains. Even fasting seasons like Lent and Advent are part of this rhythm. They sweeten the party, make the celebration feel deeper, while the church hopes farmers use these days for silent penance. Most grumble through it with thin soup until the next excuse to party comes along. The fun isn't just in the celebration itself, but in the anticipation, planning a mystery play, brewing beer, sewing ribbons onto old tunics. These are acts of hope. They gave farmers something to look forward to, a chance to feel alive, connected, a part of something bigger than themselves. And that's probably the real magic of medieval festival calendars. The whole thing connected a world always teetering on disease, invasion, or famine, with moments of laughter, music, and shared relief. Whether it was dancing around a maple tree, falling off a parade float, or burning your hand on an Yule log, farmers still found ways to celebrate both the absurd and the sacred. In the end, they didn't need luxury, just time, community, and a reason to raise a glass and shout saints, whoever you are. We made it through another year together. Saladin, or Yusuf ibn Ayyub, as his contemporaries called him, was born in 1137 in Tikrit, now part of Iraq, a pretty unremarkable start in a chaotic land. His Kurdish family wasn't royal, but not peasants either. His father, Ayyub, was a military officer serving the powerful Zengid dynasty, ruling most of Syria and northern Iraq. Yet, no one looked at young Yusuf and thought, "There's the future liberator of Jerusalem." Unlike most lords of the era, Saladin wasn't raised on a bloody battlefield. He grew up in Baalbek and, later, Damascus, where he studied theology, math, law, and poetry. He dove deep into the Quran and nurtured a lifelong love of learning. Not some reckless sword-swinging kid, but a quiet, thoughtful bookworm. Early mentors described him as gentle and deeply devout, not exactly war epic material, yet, but the world around him was anything but peaceful. The Crusaders still held Jerusalem, and the Islamic world was fractured by petty rivalries. Various emirs ruled different territories, each more interested in power than unity. Sunni and Shia factions vied for control, alliances shifting faster than desert winds. Into this chaos stepped Saladin not as a self-made hero, but as a loyal servant under his uncle, Shirkuh, a tough general serving Nur ad-Din, ruler of Aleppo. At this point, nobody expected much from Saladin. Smart, obedient, devout, but not particularly charismatic or battle-hardened. He wasn't groomed to rule. In fact, when first sent on a campaign in Egypt with Shirkuh, some records say he went reluctantly, more interested in spirituality than strategy. Politics bored him. But fate had other plans. And once Egypt opened its doors, so did opportunities. What set Saladin apart wasn't a craving for power, but the humble way he wielded it once he got it. He entered the story as a side character, a nephew, an assistant, a quiet man in a noisy world. And somehow, that quiet man changed history. Saladin didn't step into Egypt dreaming of a crown. Honestly, he didn't want the job at all. In the 1160s, Egypt, under the Fatimid dynasty, was crumbling. The story plays like a side character, a nephew, an assistant, a quiet man in a noisy world. And somehow, that quiet guy changed history. Saladin didn't march into Egypt dreaming of a crown. Nope, he wasn't eager for that gig at all. Around the 1160s, Egypt, under the Fatimid dynasty, was falling apart. A Shia regime wrestling with civil unrest, famine, and endless palace intrigue. When crusaders and various Muslim factions started causing trouble, Nuruddin sent Saladin's reliable uncle, Sheru, to restore order. Saladin, the handsome nephew, tagged along, supposedly to assist his uncle, not run the country. But surprise, that's exactly what happened. After a few years of messy campaigns, secret deals, and some suspicious natural deaths, Sheru took control of Cairo and then kicked the bucket shortly after. So the sword barely cooled in its sheath when the big question popped up: who's next? Enter Saladin. The court was hoping for someone easy to boss around. They saw a quiet, devout guy, about as exciting as watching paint dry, and with even less political ambition. Perfect. But just months later, Saladin proved he wasn't just a placeholder. Dude moved fast. First, he locked down power in Cairo, beating rivals with a mix of smooth diplomacy, religious devotion, and sheer competence. Then, with one bold move, he quietly dismantled the Fatimid Islamic regime from within. He switched loyalty back to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, ending 2 centuries of Fatimid rule. This was a religious and political earthquake, and Saladin pulled it off without mass bloodshed or palace massacres. But don't confuse mercy with weakness. He cracked down on corrupt officials, improved infrastructure, and reformed Egypt's financial mess. He gathered scholars and judges around him. He even made food more affordable for the poor. For a fractured, broken nation, he brought stability. And to outsiders, he sent a clear message. Egypt now has a real leader. But Saladin didn't call himself king. For now, he was Nur ad-Din's loyal servant. But tensions started rising. Students were standing up, teachers getting wary. Egypt wasn't just a backwater in a crumbling empire anymore. It was the heart of Saladin's rising power. Even though he wasn't chasing the throne, now that he was sitting on it, he ruled with purpose. The reluctant savior had become a real king in every way but name. And it wouldn't be long before the rest of the Islamic world took notice. Saladin's next challenge wasn't the Crusaders. It was his own side. After stabilizing Egypt, Saladin faced a divided Muslim world. The Seljuk Empire was split. Syria was ruled by his old patron, Nur ad-Din, who was now seriously suspicious of Saladin's growing influence elsewhere. Ambitious emirs fought over territory, while Jerusalem stayed in Crusader hands. In theory, they all worshipped the same god. In reality, they couldn't even throw a party together, let alone a holy war. Then, in 1174, Nur ad-Din suddenly died. And once again, a power vacuum appeared, and Saladin stepped in. At first, he claimed his actions were loyal service. He vowed to preserve Nur ad-Din's legacy, and even married into his family. But honestly, Saladin was no longer the underling. He moved north, took Damascus with hardly a fight, and began the slow, patient process of knitting the Muslim world back together, not just by conquest, but through marriage, alliances, bribes, and when needed, the occasional siege. Cities that ignored each other for decades suddenly had to listen to the guy from Tikrit. Of course, Aleppo resisted, Mosul too. But piece by piece, it all started to click, unlike many rulers of his time. Saladin wasn't known as a backstabber or a tyrant. He forgave his rivals. He kept his promises. He made it hard for people to hate him, even those he defeated. This was Saladin's silent revolution. He wasn't building an empire for ego or gold. He believed unity was sacred, that Muslims couldn't beat the Crusaders if they kept bickering among themselves. And he knew the window was closing. Crusader soldiers were tough. Jerusalem was fortified. If there was ever a time for the Muslim world to unite, it was now. By the late, the Crusaders kept bickering among themselves. And you know the window's closing fast. Those Crusader soldiers were tough. Jerusalem was fortified. If there was ever a time for the Muslim world to unite, it was now. By the end of the 1170s, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, parts of Iraq, even the holy cities Mecca and Medina. He wasn't just a regional governor anymore. He was king of an Islamic kingdom built not on brute force, but on strategy, patience, and some seriously impressive self-control. But his biggest challenge was still ahead, and it waved a flag with a cross on it. Because while Saladin had conquered cities and united kingdoms, he hadn't yet fulfilled the burning dream in every believer's heart, which was to reclaim Jerusalem. By the 1180s, Saladin was laser-focused on the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. This holy city had been in Crusader hands for nearly 90 years, a painful wound for the Islamic world, but taking it back required more than ambition. Saladin needed time, preparation, and, above all, a reason to unite his divided allies behind one goal. That reason came from the Crusaders themselves. One of the most unstable characters in the Crusader states was Riald of Sharshan, a man so famously crazy he made other Crusader lords look like cautious monks. Riald repeatedly broke agreements with Muslim caravans, attacked pilgrims on their way to Mecca, and even threatened to march on Islam's holy cities. For Saladin, this wasn't just an insult. It was divine provocation. When Riald attacked a caravan in 1187, during a time of peace, Saladin had all the justification he needed. No more deals. No more diplomacy. War was coming. The Crusader soldiers, sensing the threat, gathered all their forces. King Guy of Lusignan led the army alongside Riald and the Knights Templar. It was a fearsome force. Thousands of heavily armored men, confident in their own superiority. But they made one fatal mistake. They marched across the dry plains of Galilee in July, heading for the springs of Tiberias, thinking they'd catch Saladin off guard. Saladin let them come. He knew the terrain, understood the heat, and controlled the water. His army constantly harassed the Crusaders, cutting off access to wells and springs. When the Crusaders reached two hills called the Horns of Hattin, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and trapped. On July 4th, 1187, Saladin struck. The Battle of Hattin wasn't just a win. It was a masterpiece of strategy. The Crusader army was annihilated. Thousands were killed or captured. The True Cross, their most sacred relic, was seized. King Guy was taken prisoner, and Saladin personally executed Rield of Charshan, not out of revenge, but for breaking sacred oaths. With just one battle, Saladin broke the military backbone of the Crusader states. Nothing stood between him and Jerusalem now. But what would he do when he got to the Holy City? Winners usually use fire and blood to celebrate. Saladin had other plans. After his stunning victory at Hattin, Saladin swept across the Levant like a desert storm. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon all fell with weak resistance. The Crusaders were shattered, leaderless, and stunned. And on October 2nd, 1187, just 3 months after Hattin, Saladin stood at Jerusalem's gates. The city was defended by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader nobles still holding out, despite being outnumbered and desperate. Balian negotiated with Saladin not to win, but to be shown mercy. He warned that if the city was taken by force, the defenders would destroy the temples, massacre Muslim prisoners, and burn everything they could. It was a desperate threat. Saladin didn't call their bluff. He chose peace. Right here. Saladin's real legacy was carved not in stone, but in restraint. Unlike the bloody sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, when Christian soldiers massacred tens of thousands, Saladin's march was disciplined and cautious. No mass slaughter, no church destruction, no rivers of blood. He gave Christians the choice to ransom themselves, their families, and temples burned, Muslim prisoners slaughtered, and everything they could torch destroyed. It was a desperate threat. Saladin didn't answer that call. He chose peace, right here. Saladin's real legacy was carved not in stone, but in restraint. Unlike the bloody sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, when Christian soldiers massacred tens of thousands, Saladin's march was disciplined and cautious. No mass slaughter, no church vandalism, no rivers of blood. He gave Christians the right to ransom themselves, their families, and neighbors. Many were freed for free, especially the poor. Saladin even paid ransoms for hundreds who couldn't afford it. He let Christian priests stay and keep their services going. The Church of St. Cephala stayed intact. Holy sites were protected not just for politics, but out of genuine religious principle. For Saladin, this wasn't weakness. It was justice. He believed Jerusalem, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, shouldn't be drowned in revenge. Using power without cruelty, that's the real deal. His mercy shook Europe to its core. Even the chroniclers who hated Islam grudgingly wrote about him with respect. Some even compared him to their own kings. When he retook Jerusalem, Saladin pulled off what few thought possible. He didn't just roll back decades of Crusader conquest. He did it with grace and restraint. The city was his, but the whole world, watching from afar, started to realize his power wasn't just in the sword he wielded, but in the choice to not use it. The Christian world wasn't about to swallow that humiliation. From the West, A familiar shadow crept forward. News of Jerusalem's fall rocked Europe. The Pope preached revenge. Kings sharpened their swords. And leading the new crusade was Richard the Lionheart, King of England, warrior extraordinaire, and one of the few men whose name could stand toe-to-toe with Saladin's. So, the Third Crusade kicked off. Not just a war campaign, but a showdown between two legends. Saladin, the veteran king famous for his mercy; Richard, the bold strategist who liked his battles bloody and glorious. The world watched these two titans clash across the hills and plains of the Levant. Richard arrived in the Holy Land in 1191 and immediately took Acre. It was a brutal siege. And when talks with Saladin stalled, Richard executed 700 Muslim prisoners in a single day. Saladin, who had worked hard to save Christians in Jerusalem, was furious, but he didn't retaliate in kind. Instead, he tightened discipline and focused on strategy. These two never met face to face. But their duel was deeply personal. They clashed at Ars, where Richard scored a tactical win, but couldn't crush Saladin's army. Each battle was basically a masterclass in warfare. Richard was aggressive and clever, pulling ambushes and flank attacks. Saladin was patient, harassing supply lines, preserving strength, and avoiding pointless bloodshed. But this wasn't just a military contest. It was a battle of ideals. Richard was brave, sure, but sometimes downright ruthless. Saladin, though a fierce commander, kept showing mercy and honor, even sending doctors to treat Richard when he fell ill. Despite winning several battles, Richard never made it to Jerusalem. Logistics, weather, and Saladin's defenses blocked him. Eventually, both knew they were stuck in a stalemate. Neither could land the finishing blow. So, in 1192, they made peace. The Treaty of Jaffa let Christian pilgrims visit Jerusalem, while Saladin kept control of the city. It was a compromise, not a victory, a balance. And both men, exhausted and war-weary, respected that. In the end, Saladin protected the holy city without conquering it. Richard returned to Europe a hero, but Jerusalem stayed Muslim. Two lions roared, but only one kept the crown. Saladin's fighting skills made him famous, but it was his character that turned him into a legend. Unlike many rulers of his time, Christian or Muslim Saladin didn't drown in cruelty or surround himself with yes men. He was devout, humble, and shockingly modest for a guy ruling an empire stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia. He slept on mats, gave away his personal wealth to the poor, and bawled openly during sermons. No gilded palaces, no flashy shows of wealth, just a man. That character is what made him legendary. Unlike many rulers of his time, Christian or Muslim, Saladin didn't drown himself in cruelty or surround himself with yes men. He was devout, humble, and shockingly modest for a guy running an empire from Egypt to Mesopotamia. He slept on mats, gave away his stuff to the poor, and cried openly during sermons. No golden palaces, no flashy bling. Just a man who believed power was a test, not a prize. He fasted regularly, even outside Ramadan, and studied the Quran. With the same intensity, he studied war. Saladin prayed before battles, but more importantly, he prayed after. Not to celebrate, but to remember the lives lost. When advisors pushed him to punish enemies harshly, he often said no. He once said, Victory isn't about killing. It's about forgiveness. And he meant it. He once said, "Victory isn't about killing. It's about forgiveness." And he wasn't just blowing smoke. After taking Jerusalem, he could have built churches, executed prisoners, and thrown victory parades. Instead, he protected holy sites, freed prisoners, and made sure Christian pilgrims were safe. Even the ones, too, broke to pay fees. He even gave charity to the Jewish community and kept friendly ties with Eastern Christian sects. Saladin's generosity wasn't just about religion. He often gave his wealth to the poor, paid dowries for orphaned girls, built schools, hospitals, and fountains. His court wasn't just shiny armored warriors. It had scholars, lawyers, and poets too. But don't get it twisted. He wasn't naive. Saladin knew diplomacy, timing, and power better than most kings. He knew when to flex and when to back off. He wielded fear like a scalpel rare, but precise. And when he executed Reynold of Chaitin, it wasn't revenge, it was justice served quietly and fairly. Saladin wasn't just a military leader. He led by example. His faith wasn't for show. Mercy wasn't a weakness, and his restraint wasn't cowardice. He's one of those rare medieval figures admired by allies, enemies, and historians alike for centuries, but even legends fade. Saladin's final chapter wasn't written with a sword, but with silence. In 1193, just months after making peace with Richard the Lionheart, Saladin got seriously sick. He was only 55, not old by medieval standards. But years of non-stop war, political drama, and spiritual devotion had taken their toll. The non-stop war, political back and forth, and deep spiritual commitment cost him dearly. The man who once rode across deserts and scaled city walls was now stuck in bed, weakened by fever. He didn't call his generals. He didn't hoard wealth. Instead, he turned inward, spending his last days praying, reading the Quran, and giving away what little money he had left. And no, this isn't poetic exaggeration. When Saladin died, his treasury was so empty, there wasn't enough cash to cover his own funeral. The man who ruled empires left behind 1 dinar, 47 dirhams, and a legacy worth more than any crown. His death wasn't dramatic. No assassinations, no poisoned chalices, just a quiet exit fitting the humility he showed while ruling. He was buried in Damascus near the Grand Mosque. Not in a golden tomb or fortified palace, but a simple cemetery. His coffin was covered with plain cloth. No royal finery marking his resting place. Years later, German Emperor Wilhelm II visited his tomb and gifted a new marble coffin. Even European royalty, long after the Crusades ended, showed their respect. Saladin's empire didn't last long after his death. Like many great leaders, his power held a fragile alliance. And when he died, his sons and grandsons fought for control. Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia quickly drifted apart. But Saladin himself was never forgotten. In the Islamic world, he remains the embodiment of just rule a warrior, fighting for justice, not conquest. In the Christian world, he became a rare enemy remembered with respect, even admiration. European chroniclers called him noble, wise, even saintly terms rarely granted to outsiders. People say he kept a shroud near his bed as a reminder that nothing, not kingdoms, fame, not even Jerusalem, could come with him to the grave. Yet, centuries later, his name still lives on, Saladin died in 1193, but his legend never did. In fact, his fame spread not just across the Islamic world, but continents, cultures, and centuries. Unlike many medieval rulers who were forgotten or trashed, Saladin was remembered almost like a legend, a man of war and peace, faith and tolerance, power and humility in the Islamic world. Saladin became the poster boy for the righteous leader. For centuries, kings and rulers have invoked his name to legitimize their rule. Even though few could match his charm and discipline, his brand of holy war wasn't about fanaticism, but duty. He fought to protect land and people, not to boost his ego. He ruled fairly, ruled wisely, and died broke. In many ways, he set the gold standard for the ideal Muslim ruler that many others claim to be. But maybe the biggest surprise is that Saladin was also embraced by the Christian world, despite being the main Crusader nemesis. European historians and poets still showered him with praise. Dante placed him among the virtuous pagans in the Divine Comedy, which was a huge deal in Christian cosmology. Boccaccio wrote about his generosity, and for centuries after, Saladin morphed into a hero in European romantic tales. By the 19th century, Western leaders even used his name as a model of noble conduct during colonial wars in the Middle East. His legacy outshone his empire. In modern times, Saladin's image still packs a punch. 20th century Arab nationalists saw him as a symbol of unity and resistance. His statues still stand in Damascus and Cairo. Streets, schools, even battle tanks bear his name. He's not just a military hero, but a bridge, a figure respected by friends and foes alike. And maybe that's Saladin's greatest legacy. Not just retaking Jerusalem, or beating Crusader kings, or ruling an empire, but proving that even in an age of blood and steel, you could lead with compassion, fight with honor, and leave a legacy of respect, not terror. He died like a king. People remember him as something way bigger. Yoshiwara district in Edo isn't just a place on a map. It's a whole world locked behind wooden gates, floating on the edge of fantasy. Officially recognized by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1617, this ritual was designed to contain, control, and keep pleasure under wraps. But the problem was far messier than that. A dazzling dreamscape with painted faces, fluttering silk, and tragic love stories whispered behind paper walls. The courtesan was the star of this place, not just a prostitute, but a cultural superstar. The oiran were the creme de la creme, the top tier, trained for years in art, poetry, music, calligraphy, and the fine art of flirting. They wore layers of embroidered kimonos, hair pinned up with elaborate combs that looked like tiny weapons, and their every move was rehearsed to perfection. A single glance from an oiran could cost a fortune. A conversation, even more. From the outside, it looks glamorous, but inside, Yoshiwara was a gilded cage. Once, a woman stepped into the playground, usually sold off as a desperate kid by her parents. Her fate was sealed. Contracts could last decades. Debt was almost impossible to escape. She was renamed, transformed, and turned into a product. The outside world became just rumors. The irony: these women were masters of performance, admired for their elegance and charm, but prisoners nonetheless, not of chains, but silk and duty. And for the clients, Yoshiwara offered illusions as much as reality. Samurai could ditch their armor. Merchants could pretend to be poets, and everyone could forget their act for one night. But that illusion vanished come morning. Names were forgotten, and love, if it bloomed, left only decay and memory, debts almost impossible to escape. She was renamed, given a makeover, and turned into someone sellable. The outside world turned into rumor. The irony. These women were masters of performance, admired for their grace and charm, yet prisoners not of chains, but of silk and duty. And for the clients, Yoshiwara offered as much illusion as reality. Samurai could shed their armor. Merchants could pretend to be poets. And everyone could forget their act for one night. But that illusion lasted only till dawn. By morning, names were forgotten, and love, if it blossomed, turned to rot in memory. True feelings were downright dangerous in Yoshiwara, even banned. A courtesan caught falling in love risked punishment, or, worse, being sold off to another brothel. A samurai caught loving below his rank. Game over, but life's messy, and it kept happening. Whispers of forbidden love snaked through alleys like smoke always lurking. Never safe. That's the paradox of Yoshiwara, a world built to sell love, where real love only spelled disaster. Outside Yoshiwara's gates, people often mix up geisha with courtesans. But inside the red light district, the lines are crystal clear well. Except sometimes, candlelight and perfume make things a bit blurry. Courtesans, especially the high-class ones, are the real stars of Yoshiwara. Legally, they're prostitutes, but culturally, they're treated like celebrities. Clients don't just pay for a night of fun. They're buying a taste of desire, a living poem stitched on silk. The untouchable status of one of these ladies only comes if you're as patient as a monk and as lucky as a daimyo. Wooing her might drag on for months, and that's how it's supposed to be. Only the richest and most persistent get to share a futon. Geishas, on the other hand, are entertainers not lovers? They play shamisen, craft cheeky haikus, and pour sake with years of practiced grace, and pour that sack with a charm honed through long apprenticeships. Their art is their allure. Mistaking a geisha for a courtesan is like insulting her profession and the strict social rules Yoshiwara lives by. A geisha can flirt, tease, even dance inches from a client's face. But if he expects more, he's laughed out of the tea house, fast. But behind that clear divide, they both share a heartbreaking truth. Choice is just an elaborate illusion. Most women in Yoshiwara aren't there out of ambition. They're sold, orphaned, or just too poor to live outside the walls. Debt, contracts, and reputation trap them. Quitting the trade, especially at its peak, was nearly impossible without a wealthy patron to buy back her freedom. Muki. That rare practice wasn't always romantic. It could mean rescue or just swapping one form of ownership for another. Still, many women found ways to carve out moments of autonomy. A witty comment in a tea house, a rebellious glance while dancing, or a secret poem slipped into a client's sleeve. In Yoshiwara's rigid structure, subtle defiance became its own art form. Perfect dance moves aside. What's missing are the sacrifices made behind the curtain and the silent sacrifices behind the curtain and the delicate survival negotiations that played out night after night beneath flickering lantern light, never theirs to own. In theory, samurai weren't allowed to fall in love in Yoshiwara. They were honorable men, responsible, bound to their lords, loyal to the shogunate, expected to show stoic restraint. But Yoshiwara is a world designed to make men forget who they are. And, for some samurai, This was not just a distraction. It was a trap. A woman in silk lingerie, incense, and a smile that knows too much. Love affairs between courtesans and samurai were banned, not because they were rare, but because they were too common and too dangerous for a courtesan. Love threatened the carefully crafted image she'd built. A courtesan couldn't afford favoritism. She was a commodity, a living dream. If she loved, she risked ruining both her life and the fragile power balance inside the brothel. For samurai, the stakes were even higher. Loving a courtesan meant losing honor, risking scandal, and worst of all, breaking Tokugawa's strict social class rules. Samurai weren't supposed to fall for women in pleasure quarters. They came to watch, enjoy, and forget. Love wasn't part of the contract, not part of the deal. But then, it happened. Sometimes, samurai came back, again and again, spending beyond their means, secretly writing haikus, slipping love letters hidden in fans. Sometimes, the courtesan responded, a gentle squeeze of the hand, a hidden poem slipped into his sleeve. This wasn't cheating. It was a quiet rebellion against a world that always demanded masks. But the fallout could be brutal. There are stories of samurai who sold their swords just to spend time with their lovers. Some lost status, property, even their lives. A few got caught and were ordered to perform seppuku, ritual suicide to redeem their shame for the women. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to being forced into harsher brothels. But the saddest tales don't end in scandal, but in sorrow. Lovers realize there's no escape, no future, just a faint scent and promises made far too late. That's when the worst consequences happen. The double suicide pact. Shinju. Two lovers bound by a love the world refuses, choosing death over spending one more day apart. In Yoshiwara, love blossoms like cherry blossoms, beautiful, fleeting, and doomed to fade. In a place where every glance is staged and every touch has a price, the only space where love can survive is the silence between words. And in Yoshiwara, it's words, not whispers, that let forbidden hearts speak up. Poetry isn't just entertainment. It's a secret language. Haikus and short poems float in the air like falling petals, exchanged between geishas and clients, carrying feelings too risky to say out loud. A carefully crafted poem, hidden in a fan or tucked into a kimono sleeve, can carry the longing of a whole heart without ever naming love. For courtesans and others, poetry is part of their schooling. They're trained to improvise, weaving elegance into sadness, flirting into metaphor. A courtesan might reply to a client's passionate poem with a subtle rejection, a poem about an unreachable moon, or a river too wide to cross. But if she returns the feeling, her words become a lifeline, a promise, or a secret vow. Samurai, merchants, even court poets flock to Yoshiwara not just for pleasure, but for the chance to duel in verse with women whose pens are as sharp as their eyes. Love letters aren't crude. They're folded artfully, scented with plum perfume, and tucked neatly into sleeves or sandals. But each poem is a risk. A love letter caught by a madam could mean punishment. A client lingering too long near a house might get exposed. And if a samurai's lord finds out about his feelings, his career could be ruined or worse. Still, the poems survive. Some have become legends, preserved in old notebooks, reprinted in literary collections. copied by later lovers hoping to catch that magnificent beauty. Others were burned before dawn, their ashes carried away like secrets too dangerous to keep. In a world where love is a transaction, poetry lets it be something else, fragile, fleeting, forbidden, something you can hold in your hands, read by candlelight, and for a moment believe is real. For most women in Yoshiwara, freedom isn't a dream. It's a calculation, a number, a price. Courtesans, especially the elite, are chained by contracts heavier than any shackle. They're in debt for training, clothes, housing, even daily meals. Every kimono, every hairdresser, every performance is recorded, charged, and piled onto a tab, growing faster than it shrinks. The only way out is muck. The act of being bought out. A patron, often a wealthy merchant or retired samurai, can pay off all debts and secure the courtesan's release. Sounds romantic, and sometimes it is, but usually it's just a swap, one golden cage traded for another. Some women are truly rescued, marrying rich men or allowed peaceful lives away from Edido's red lanterns. Others simply move from one slave role to another, a kept wife, a mistress, or releasing a courtesan sounds romantic, and sometimes it was, but mostly it was just a trade one gilded cage swapped for another. Some women really escaped marrying rich or starting quiet lives away from Idedo's red lantern glow. Others just shuffled from one kind of slavery to another, a mistress, a secret second wife, kept hidden and only paraded when convenient, even when free. Equality was rare. Then there were those who tried to run without paying up. Spoiler happy endings were rare. Yoshiwara was guarded tight. Surveillance was brutal. Women caught fleeing faced harsh punishments paraded through streets, shamed by shaved heads, or worse, got shipped off to a worse brothel with even nastier conditions. But every once, in a blue moon, a courtesan would vanish, disguised as a maid, hiding in a warehouse, escorted by a lover ready to risk it all. These ladies turned into urban legends, whispered over tea, immortalized in kabuki plays, always ending the same way, bitterly. Freedom. But at what cost? Still, despite the risks, the urge to escape never died. It lived on in the stories they told each other, in lullaby folk songs at night, in poems hidden beneath tatami mats, because in Yoshiwara, even the most obedient courtesan carried two lives, the show she put on and the dream she chased when the lanterns dimmed. Life outside the brothel, a life with her own name, a love without receipts. Escaping was rare, redemption even rarer. But in a world built on illusions, hope was the one thing no one could tax. In a place designed to sell pleasure, some of Yoshiwara's most stubborn love stories were tragedies, and nothing was bigger than the obsessed ritual of Shinju, the lover's suicide pact. This wasn't just dramatic flair or theatrical legend, though kabuki loved turning it into both. These were real, chilling events born from despair. In Yoshiwara, when a courtesan and her lover faced a world that forbade their union, when freedom was impossible, debts piled high, and love became unbearable. Death seemed like the only escape. Most pacts followed a pattern. The courtesan, usually locked into a long contract, couldn't leave the brothel without a hefty payout. Her lover, often a samurai, or wealthy merchant, had family duties, social expectations, or dwindling fortunes, making escape impossible. They'd meet in secret, write poetry, share a final cup of tea, then disappear into the night by the riverbank, the woods, or a rented room. Some slit their throats with hidden blades. Others drowned themselves in nearby canals, silk cords in hand. Their bodies were often found still entwined, as if even death couldn't pull them apart. The public reaction was a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Officials condemned Shinju as immoral and disruptive. Brothels tightened security. The shogunate banned such stories from the stage, but nobody could look away. These tragic deaths were romanticized in literature and song, turned into folklore and kabuki plays. Plays like the Amajima lover's suicide turned real-life despair into cultural legend. Audiences wept. Poets wrote elegies. But behind the drama was the cold, hard truth. They were trapped in social roles, craving dignity so badly that death seemed kinder than life. Not every courtesan died for love. Most survived, endured, and quietly aged out of Yoshiwara. But those who chose death or had no real choice carved their names into Japanese cultural memory with blood and flowers. In a world obsessed with performance, Shinju was probably the only act you couldn't fake. In the flickering candlelight of Yoshiwara, art wasn't just decoration, it was defiance. Every fluttering fan, every brushstroke of calligraphy, every carefully folded kimono was a silent rebellion against a life with zero freedom. The girls, Oija Setran and Geisha in the pleasure quarters, were true artists. They trained in traditional music, dance, ink painting, poetry, and social graces. Their job was to embody the ideal of beauty, intelligence, and calm that impossible standard only reached through relentless discipline. But this wasn't passive performance. It was control in a world that took almost everything from these women. The beauty armor, the perfectly styled wig, a poem capturing sorrow in 17 syllables, a dance that screams unsaid longing. This isn't just a show for customers. It's how they hold on to their identity, dignity, and self-awareness in a world designed to erase them. When a courtesan bows with flawless grace or cranks out a haiku under pressure, she's basically saying, I'm still here. I still get to decide how you see me. Art spills beyond the brothel walls too. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, those floating world images, captured courtesans in vibrant color. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaru and Suzuki Harunibu caught glimpses of their lives. A woman fixing her hairpin, a geisha gazing out the window, lovers meeting under falling cherry blossoms. These images blew up in popularity, snatched up by both commoners and nobles. They turned penguin birds into symbols while also revealing the loneliness behind the beauty. Some courtesans even became muses. Their faces showed up in paintings, plays, and erotic novels. Their poems were published in little notebooks, traded like treasure among the intellectual crowd. For some, this artistic fame brought something rare, a voice. Yet, art could never tell the full truth. Behind every footprint was a woman in debt. Behind every poem, a contract. Behind every graceful smile, someone counting down days to freedom or growing too old to hope. But art gave them something they weren't supposed to have. It let them shape their own story, even if it was just in scattered pieces. And in a world built to control their narrative, even a shard holds power. In Yoshiwara, beauty wasn't just currency. It was a ticking clock. Every painted face, every silk sleeve hid an expiration date. Outside the playground, the world might worship the courtesan as a symbol of grace and sex appeal. But inside, everyone knew youth was trendy, and it didn't last long. A courtesan's value dipped the moment she peaked. Her schedule got lighter, her clients aged, new girls came fresher, trendier, more popular, and just like a lantern fading at dawn, her spotlight dimmed until she quietly disappeared. No grand farewell for most women, no ceremony, no parade. Some retired quietly after paying off debts, opening tea houses, or becoming hairdressers. Others took backstage roles, training new girls, styling hair, or managing bookings. But many just vanished, kicked out of the playground when they stopped selling illusions. A lucky few were bought out before time caught them. A wealthy sponsor might whisk them off to a private estate or offer marriage, though even that rescue was often just a different kind of slavery. For those who aged without a patron, survival meant adapting. And adapting in a society that worshipped female beauty above all else usually meant humiliation. In rare cases, former courtesans reinvented themselves as okami, the respected owners of tea houses or inns, using their smarts, connections, and social skills to get by. But those were exceptions. Most left Yoshiwara with one outfit to change into, and memories of a life, both dreamy and exhausting. No one made woodblock prints of them once their cheeks lost their rosy glow. No poet wrote verses for sagging eyes or wrinkled hands. The world that once worshipped them erased them as soon as they stopped shining. Yet, in those quiet exits, something real remained. The illusion dissolved. The silk robes were folded away. The smiles no longer needed, because in Yoshiwara, tragedy wasn't just lost love. Which poet wrote odes to saggy eyes or wizened hands? The world that once worshipped them wiped them out the moment they stopped shining. But in those quiet escapes, something real lingered. The illusions faded. Silk robes were folded away. Smiles no longer needed, because in Yoshiwara, tragedy wasn't just lost love or faded youth. It was the silence that followed. When the music stopped, candles burned out, and the woman behind the last mask finally went home nameless and unseen. Today, Yoshiwara's lanterns no longer glow. The narrow streets that once echoed with laughter, music, and whispered poetry are now filled with apartment blocks and convenience stores. But the stories still linger like smoke. Yoshiwara officially closed in 1958 when, by then, the district had faded into almost nothing, mostly ruins of its former self. World War II bombings had wrecked much of the city's architecture, the glamorous pleasure houses, the fan shops, the fragrant tea rooms, poof, all gone. Along with them, the lives of thousands of women were wiped from public memory. But Yoshiwara, it never truly died. Its spirit lives on in kabuki plays, ukiyo-e prints, novels, and old poems still taught in classrooms. The Uran Parade is reenacted at festivals, where young women don towering wigs and 12 layers of kimono to honor those who came before. Few remember the names, But the courtesans of Yoshiwara remain etched deep in Japan's cultural imagination, not just as entertainers, but as survivors, poets, and quiet revolutionaries. Modern Japan still wrestles with this legacy. On one hand, these women get romanticized as icons of elegance and mystery. On the other, their suffering is often swept under the rug. Their lives remain misunderstood, blurred by illusion and shame. They weren't just women with fancy makeup. They were children sold into slavery, artists who turned their performances into power, lovers who risked everything for a genuine connection. Maybe that's why their ghosts still roam. Locals tell stories of Yoshiwara's spirits. Women wandering alleys at night, kimono trailing behind, searching for something lost. Others say the old brothels hold a strange silence, like the past refuses to be completely buried. A strange silence fell, as if the past refused to be fully covered up. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the truth remains, Yoshiwara is part of Japan's soul, a memory of a hidden world built on illusion, soaked in tragedy, but also filled with unmatched beauty and fleeting moments of joy.